I'm going to speak about Libya and men who tiptoe into their marital bedrooms. But before I do, or before I tell you what that is referring to, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how I started working on this book, Anatomy of a Disappearance. Novels start in many different ways. They have many different beginnings. Some beginnings are within beginnings. But one of the very first beginnings of this book happened in 2004, when I thought I had finished my first book, In the Country of Men, what I thought was the final draft. And I took myself to this hotel by the sea. And I stayed in this hotel for a few days, intending to do nothing but lie by the pool. I sort of set up this incredibly detailed program for myself, where I would wake up in the morning, I would swim in the swimming pool, I would read by the pool, have my coffee, go have breakfast, then go swim in the sea, and just spend the whole day lounging and reading. That was the intention. But after the first day, something extraordinary happened. I watched this hotel. It was out of season. It was almost deserted. There was no one else except me and an army of waiters and people that worked in the hotel. And one day when I was lying by the pool, I saw this man, a young man, maybe sort of late 20s, early 30s, walk beside this older man who was probably in his 80s. They weren't talking to one another, but they were close by, and the young man had his hand cupping the elbow of the older man. And I think that's maybe what we mean when we say inspiration, in the sense that an event happens, it's very precise, maybe even banal, but it seems mysterious, infinite. It contains within it so many other possibilities. It seems to be out of this world. And I focused on them. I watched them walk across, past the pool, onto the beach, walk by the sea, until they disappeared. And although they weren't talking, there was their gait and this wonderfully gentle, tender gesture seemed to say a lot about their relationship. I had no idea whether they were father and son, whether they were uncle and nephew. Perhaps even it seemed perfectly credible at that moment to me that they might be the same man, different stages of his life, reminding me of that wonderful story by Jorge Luis Borges of a man who goes and sits on a park bench, and this other man comes, sits next to him, an older man, and they are really the same man. And so I started scribbling, I started writing. I didn't read the stack of books I had brought with me. I just started writing pages, about a dozen pages or so. And then I returned to In the Country of Men and realized it wasn't done at all, and I spent another year and a half or 2 years finishing it. And when I finished In the Country of Men, I looked at those dozen pages and I decided that's going to be my next book. And I started working on it, trying to understand more about this moment that I noticed and that I observed, and why it resonated so deeply with me. And as the book developed, it became clear that it's a book about a relationship between a father and a son, and an obsession that a son has towards his father, and a father who is absent, a father who had vanished. And he isn't like me, in the sense that I also have had the misfortune of losing my father to this sort of this uncertain fate. Whereas I sort of go and look for my father, try to find my father, campaign to find my father's whereabouts. Nouri, the protagonist of Anatomy of a Disappearance, doesn't do any of these things. What he does instead is he tries to occupy the space of his father, almost in a physical, existential sense. And so he does very odd things. He lives in his father's houses, he wears his father's clothes, he stalks his father's lovers. He is in some way, in a very extreme way, in a very unhealthy way, a faithful son. And so as the book developed, 3 years into working on this book, something extraordinary happened. My father, who was a political prisoner in Libya and disappeared in Gaddafi's prison system, the last sighting, the last communication, he had smuggled some letters out of prison, last of which was dated 1996. And the last sighting was also around the same time. I get a phone call 3 years into writing Anatomy of a Disappearance from a friend of mine in Libya who says to me, I have just met a man who's a political prisoner who claims to have seen your father in 2002. And this was a tremendous news. I mean, tremendous in the way that a flood or a storm is tremendous. And I couldn't help but think that somehow by devoting myself into the act of trying to make something authentic, something coherent, and hopefully something beautiful out of my meditation on this subject of loss, or this very ambiguous sense of loss when somebody disappears, I had somehow provoked this event. And what it did is that it consumed me totally and threw me into campaigning more vigorously than before to find out the whereabouts of my father. And it brought to mind this relationship between the imagination and reality. So I wasn't writing a book about me and my father at all. I was writing a book that was trying to make sense of this subject, which I saw on some level as an active resistance. So an active resistance is that you try to sing about these terrible things, that this act of loss that was inflicted on me won't stop me from trying to, as an artist, to do something with it. And it reminded me of other incidences where history tries to obliterate the artist. Because in my view, I think the artist sits outside of the march. The march passes down the avenue, and the artists are perched on trees, and they refuse. And once in a while, a rock, somebody throws a stone at one of the artists, determined to get them to fall down from one of the trees. And this had happened to me in many different ways, but not in this way. One example was when I had run away to Paris to try to write in the country of men. I got approached by somebody in the Libyan opposition, said, would you be our man at the UN for human rights and a very important job. And I had absolutely no money, so just the idea of a job was very attractive. But I said no, and I said no in a way that surprised me. I said no very quickly. I didn't say, give me a couple of days, let me think about it. I said no straight away. And recently, in these events, now that's what's happening in Libya, and being involved in getting information from inside the country and giving it to journalists here or putting journalists in touch with people there. Somebody in the council, in the temporary council in Libya, approached me and said, would you work for us? And again, with all of my sympathies, I said no in this very abrupt, quick way. And I kept thinking, why am I doing this? And I think because it comes back to this belief that that sort of involvement would obliterate the artist in me. It would destroy my independence. It would destroy my little, very uncomfortable place on the tree, perched on the tree. And so I refused that. Also, I think it was helped by the way how these offers are said. It's usually the terms are, so are you content with what you're doing, or would you like to do something more active? My answer was, no, I am not content with what I'm doing, and I'm not content with doing something active. In fact, I'm very determined to remain discontent. But this on some level, was these men that have tiptoed into their marital bedrooms have helped me. These two extraordinary events that happened 45 years apart but have an uncanny similarity and have been in my mind recently with all of this, with all of what's been going on. The first one was a very charismatic French general in 1945, after liberation, goes over to an award-winning French novelist, and he says to him, would you be my minister? I want you to be the minister of culture for the new France. And the writer says, no, I'm not going to do that. So the general is Charles de Gaulle, the writer is André Malraux. So Charles de Gaulle puts it in, his first attempt is flattery. So he says to Malraux, he says, but you are our greatest writer. You would be a wonderful minister. And Malraux says, no thanks. So his second attempt is to manipulate him, maybe even to mildly threaten him. So he says to him, now look, if you're not going to be minister, I am not responsible for what will happen to French culture. And Charles de Gaulle does all of these tactics. Eventually, he succeeds. And the night that Charles de Gaulle succeeds, he goes home and he tiptoes into his marital bedroom. And Yvonne de Gaulle turns on the light, finds Charles de Gaulle standing against the window, unbuttoning his military uniform jacket. And she says to him, darling, where were you? And he says, tonight, and I have always imagined him pausing here for some reason. He says, tonight, I assassinated Marlowe. Marlowe works for him until Charles de Gaulle leaves public life in 1969. And 20 years later, and stands against the window, unbuttoning his jacket, not a military uniform, but a dinner jacket. And Pietrizia turns on the light and doesn't say to him, darling, where were you? She knows exactly where he was, because he has confetti on his shoulders, confetti on his hair. All she says is, once, and again here I imagine her pausing, once I used to be married to a novelist. Thank you.